It's Just Business with Steve Thomas and your host, Chris Larry.
Hello and welcome to another episode of It's Just Business on the Hogsty Podcasting Network, coast to coast, global reach. How you doing today, Steve?
I'm doing good, man. I'm sorry you guys are like undergoing a snowmageddon apparently again. It's from what I've been told. I told you before the air, before we jumped on, that I was distressed that I had to turn the heat on and leave it on for 2 weeks. That greatly bothers me. Down here in South Texas, that is something we're not used to. So it's burr down here.
Well, I just want you, dear podcast listener, dedicated audience, that I'm a dedicated to serve you as I trudged downhill, actually, but downhill through a blizzard, 10 plus inches of snow to get to a place to record this podcast. So sacrifices have been made.
He literally walked through 10 inches of snow for you. That is dedication, people.
That's right.
Listen, applaud to Chris for that kind of dedication.
Yeah, unfortunately, I probably have to be going out again in it to take children sledding, so you can also feel sorry for me going forward.
Yeah, feel sorry for me too. I've had to wear a jacket. Probably will have to wear a jacket today and long pants. I don't think people should be subjected to that kind of cruelty.
Well, here we are. But the world of sports business is not slowed down for weather. And, we're going to do a kind of a multi-layered check-in the cold stove of Major League Baseball. Maybe see if we can find the matches, respark it, turn the oil back on. But what the heck is going on? We know we are in a lockout situation. So let's just jump in there to sort of see where the current state of non-play is with Major League Baseball.
Yeah, so I think you can summarize this by saying the Padres are not getting along very well, although they have made some tiny amount of progress. So there's a whole bunch of different stories. What I happen to be looking at here is Sports Illustrated from January 26th. So when the teams were locked out a while ago, the Major League Baseball and Major League Baseball Players Association had a meeting that lasted exactly 7 minutes, but right before the lockout, which basically sort of was an F you, and we're locked out. Well, they have actually sat down now and have had some legitimate discussions about issues, which is good because we have pitchers and catchers scheduled to report here in like 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks maybe, into February. So what is going on here is that, surprise of surprises, they're fighting about money. And what it all kind of all the issues boil down to this. The Players Association want the players to make more money, and Major League Baseball does not want to pay them more money. Imagine that. Imagine that's where we are. What are the specifics? Some of the specifics here are they are arguing about the how big the luxury tax is going to be. The players wanted up to $245 million. The league, the last league, the offer the league made was only $214 million. And this is, by the way, if you don't know, is the line above which teams have to pay luxury tax on their payroll. But the other stuff that they're arguing about here currently is the arbitration process, the mechanisms of it and when it kicks in and when it ends, and then minimum salaries for pre-arbitration players to include the creation of a bonus pool, and the distance with the parties are at with the bonus pool is absurd. The Players Association was at like $110 million, and Major League Baseball is at like $10 million. Yeah, $10 million. So I'd say that as an overall point, that it's good that they're talking, and Major League Baseball has made a couple concessions with regard to arbitration, so that's good. But they're really, really far apart now. So we're coming. I always say, when you're talking about negotiations, deadlines help. and we're coming down to the point where, uh, the deadline needs to start helping. Put it that way. But your thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, obviously that all makes sense. There's two, as you start to, we're at the level of negotiation where you're starting to see what the issues are and where the parameters of a deal happen, or where the sticking points of a deal happening are going to live. And so two things started to pop out at me that I just find interesting as we start to see the shape of this thing. One is something that you talked about when we talked about Major League Baseball and their labor issues now going on probably a couple years, is that it looks like the players have backed off on the free agency issues. So this, they wanted to get the sort of term of service before you could hit free agency. I think it's currently 6 years, depending on
6 years now. But let me stop you. So what Chris was talking about is, so the way it's not like the NFL, because I know we have a lot of football fans here. In the NFL, you have your rookie contract, and if you get past basically year 3, you're not an exclusive rights free agent anymore, and you get past year 4, you're unrestricted free agent. Well, in baseball, there's a pre-arbitration phase where you're just stuck with minimum salaries, and then there's an arbitration phase that takes you all the way up to year 6 before you can escape and become an unrestricted free agent. That's what we're negotiating. But go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so I just find that interesting, because that was a big focus for the players over the last couple of years, something that they've been frustrated by since with the current rules. So to them to have backed off that, it looks like, and that sounded like it was a sort of a real line in the sand for Major League Baseball, that stay, like a thing they were willing to lose games over, or at least they were fronting like they were willing to lose games over. So I think to see the players back away from that, you start to see where the new lines of the deal eventually will be. So I found that super interesting to see that piece of it sort of remain status quo probably through this deal.
Yeah, I think I said when we talked about this before that if I was the Players Association, that would have been the single biggest issue I had. Beyond probably the luxury tax, because that holds a lot of players back in terms of income. And this is, by the way, why the owners have drawn the line in the sand over it, because they know what a big deal it is. Just think, I mean, my view is always Dodger centric, but so think about this: Cody Bellinger gets to free agency 1 year earlier. That could mean a difference of like $20 million to him for the first year, or more, and it will be more in coming years. Or, pick your play, like Bryce Harper signed just an absurd deal with the Phillies. If that had happened 1 year earlier, add another $30 million to his pocket and another $30 million to the payroll of the Phillies. And so that is why it's important, and that's why if it had been me, that's the hill I probably would have died on if I was representing the Players Association. I do think it's fascinating that they just caved on that immediately. Pretty much immediately, at least, and it looks like, I mean, the owners have drawn a line in the sand a little bit on the luxury tax. They offered to raise it all of $4 million. So we're basically where we're at is there's a $41 million difference between where the players and the owners are. The owners want it at $214 million. The players have offered $245.
And if you read the runes from these type of things happening, it seems pretty clear that that Major League Baseball has the leverage. I think is if you sort of look at what's going on here, you can sort of see where this is going, and they're in pretty good shape, I'd say, as these negotiations grind on. The other thing that caught my interest, and this sort of does straddle labor negotiations plus how the game is played, is the playoff issue. So basically, an expanded playoff is almost a guarantee at this point. And what's interesting is this is a way that the sides can come together, because, if you're not willing to share more of the pot of what exists, then the next thing to do in collaboration really is to expand your market, right? To expand, what you can actually earn revenue on. Then the players get more and the owners have more to dole out. So it looks like that area of, quote unquote, new money is going to come from an expanded playoffs. And sounds like, Steve, you'll know more, but right now the players would like to see it expanded to 12 teams, and Major League Baseball would like to see it expanded to 14 teams. That seems to be where the discussion is landing right now.
Yeah, and recall if you go back to 2020, which was the shortened COVID season, the one that the Dodgers ended up winning, they were at 14 teams in the playoffs, and then they backed off to 10 for this past year. And so, yes, there is a difference in what the baseball wants versus what the union wants, and it's kind of fascinating as to why. I mean, Major League Baseball wants more teams in the playoffs because more games, more ratings equals more income. Whereas the union proposing 12, I think is a little bit interesting to me that they would want less. I'm not 100% sure the logic in taking a position like that, other than I think my concern, generally speaking, is that you expand the playoffs too much and you have it almost becomes kind of a joke. If you've got a bunch of, like baseball historically has had a very strict playoff admission standard. And so if you span it too much, then the playoffs lose a little bit of their interest, I think, by having teams in there that probably aren't worthy. But I think it's fascinating that that's the argument, to me. You would think that the players would be all for it too, because the players get paid for being in playoff games, and the more players in playoff games means more money for them. So I find it interesting that they're at a bit of a loggerhead over it. I don't totally understand it.
My interpretation is that, especially if you accept the hypothesis that right now it looks like the owners, Major League Baseball, have the upper hand in these negotiations, then the players are going to hold pseudo lines, right? I think they'll be willing to come up on that, right? But they want to have some area of discussion, and they also know that eventually they'll give on that. So I almost think it's like a little bit of a false front from the players, because I basically agree with you. They're going to, more is more, really, is how you view this, and they'll eventually move towards that position. They're just not going to give it away right now, especially when they don't have that much to negotiate on.
Well, it's kind of like, they're losing on the money issues, so we're going to argue about the cheese and crackers in the waiting room.
Exactly.
That's kind of what it is. Because here's I think the macro level takeaway from this, in my view. The public has a perception that the Major League Baseball Players Union is the strongest union of the three major American sports: football, basketball, baseball. The last CBA, the Players Union got smoked. Baseball Players Union. They were really mad at the end of it all. The players were, that they had given so many concessions to the owners in terms of money, the ultimate money part of it. And they're losing again now. I mean, think about how far baseball's come. Baseball has a soft cap in place. They never had that before. That's a major, major point, in favor of the owners. And so I'm not sure if the Players Association has lost influence. Maybe, I think Tony Clark is the head of the Players Association. If he's not as good as some of the guys in the past, or the owners have just grown a pair, but I don't think the Players Association has the influence they used to have.
No, and I would agree. And if you look historically at the times where that sort of myth or legend, and was a reality at the time of that being the strongest union, they had major, national level labor lawyers representing them. Lawyers who define labor negotiations and with unions as much as anyone in their field. So I think they don't have that. And this is through multiple lawyers, but I think the reason they had that status is because they had the best lawyers.
Yeah, that's true. And I think what players a lot of times, I think this is true for all the players' unions, really make a mistake sometimes in electing players to do these negotiations, because they don't really know what the hell they're doing, especially not compared to a bunch of billionaires who have been negotiating business deals for their entire adult lives. And you're going to throw a baseball player up there against them, no wonder you're going to get slaughtered. And so, yeah, if and I don't know who's representing the union now, but I think that could very likely be a major, major problem if they don't have the equivalent business negotiation brain power up as do the owners. Yeah, I think that's obviously is a major problem. And I mean, again, just think about what they've lost here over the past several or past couple CBAs. The luxury tax is a massive concession that has kept salaries in check more than anything else. Even the big money teams, the Yankees and the Dodgers and the Red Sox, even those teams have to pay attention to it because it is so onerous that it's almost not a soft cap for the average team. You think about that.
In New York City, the baby Steinbrenners have been way less willing to go over that luxury tax than Daddy.
It goes up to 95%. And so basically the gist of how the MLB luxury tax works is if you increase it you go over the minimum by a certain amount, you get a small tax that some richer teams can live with. You keep going up more and more and more. The tax gets more and more onerous, and then it also gets bigger the number of years in a row you go over it. So if you ever hear baseball talking about a reset, this is what they mean. Like the big money teams, again, the Yankees, the Dodgers, the Red Sox, the Cubs, all of them reset. And so they'll cut. That's when you see like the Corey Seagers of the world end up not a Dodger anymore, because they're trying to reset the cap. So it has had a major impact on the game. The one thing here that another point I think we need to raise it is an issue is that the players want more of a revenue sharing model than do the owners. Because the players see the problem with teams like the Pirates, the Marlins, and a couple others that have just absurdly low salary caps, and that hurts the salaries of the players. So the players want more, have asked for more of a revenue sharing in these tax, and that's part of why their proposals for the luxury tax are how they are, is to get more money to those other teams, and the owners don't really like that.
No, and that is an area where you may see the owners give a little bit, because there are some benefits to them as well, and different. There's also different opinions about that within the ownership about how much of that shared responsibility should be there, so that the league isn't sort of weighed down by those teams that are always at bargain basement management, et cetera, et cetera. So that might be an area where you do see a little bit of the players get a little ground.
I think so, and the gist of the difference in opinion in the owners is that the owners of those absurdly low franchises want more revenue sharing, and the Dodgers, Yankees, Red Sox, Cubs of the world don't want to share their money. That's it's as simple as that. But I think you can move the cheese and crackers around a little bit with that too, and the players can convince themselves that they got a little bit of a win there, probably. But I mean, for the root issues, it seems like which is again, how much money can teams spend, and the amount of money being directed towards individual players. It seems like that's already over. If you read these stories, it seems like baseball's already won on a lot of those points.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. You can see where the lines are going to be, and it definitely does not look in the players' favorability. Well, speaking of players and their favorability, we also had a recent Hall of Fame announcement about who will be the class of, I guess, what do they call it, 2021 or 2022?
I think it's 2022.
The class of 2022 will be a cohort of one, David Ortiz, who will be the only player elected, or that was elected to the Hall of Fame. And this, I think, marks the 10-year mark of eligibility for a bunch of the, quote-unquote steroid era superstars, most exemplified by Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens. Steve, I know you have all the feels about this. Where are you at?
Yeah, I really dislike. Also, let me say it differently. I think the Baseball Hall of Fame has managed its process really, really badly. Put it like that. The idea that you have probably the greatest player in baseball history not in the Hall. And Barry Bonds, and this is coming from a Dodger fan, folks. Barry Bonds, if you forget how he got there, Barry Bonds is probably the greatest player ever, including Babe Ruth, just from a numbers perspective. Roger Clemens, by anybody's measure, is a top 5 pitcher of all time. He won more Cy Youngs. I think he's got 7 Cy Youngs, more than anybody. Kurt Schilling is not in the Hall of Fame. Mainly, what's the common denominator with all these people? 1, steroid accusations. 2, they're all 3 of them are unlikable people. David Ortiz, by the way, himself is not clean necessarily.
Named in the report.
Mitchell report.
Yeah.
So what the Mitchell report, for those who don't know what we're talking about, is the former commissioner. What was his name? Selig. Commissioned former Senator, I can't remember his first name, Mitchell.
George Mitchell.
Okay, to do an investigation into steroids in baseball, and in conjunction with that, they tested a bunch of players, and they were supposed to be anonymous, and the idea was that baseball wanted to see what kind of problem they had, and predictably, all those names leaked, and Ortiz is one of them that tested positive, but David Ortiz is not a jerk. David Ortiz is very personable. He's very charismatic. He's been on TBS or ESPN, whatever. He's one of the talking heads, baseball talking heads. Barry Bonds is an immensely dislikable person. But here's my point. The Baseball Hall of Fame is a nonprofit. We figured this out before the show. Their entire mission in life is to tell the story of baseball. I don't know how you tell the story of baseball without especially Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds and Pete Rose. He's the other one, the all-time hits leader, not in the Hall of Fame. Why gambling? What is baseball doing now? Marrying up with gambling. So I think the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame has become a joke. And I think they don't have a lot of credibility anymore. In their process, you guys understand their process? They've got, don't quote me on the number, but something like 300 voters, all media members. And it's basically the entire Pro Baseball Writers Association. It's basically more or less who are the voters. Some of those guys aren't even writing about baseball anymore. They haven't for years. They're a bunch of grouchy curmudgeons. Some of them turn in blank ballots. I don't know how this entity thinks they have any credibility when you have that broken of a voting process, and you have 3 players who were never banned by baseball. They never were tested positive for steroids. For all of Barry Bonds' problems, he never tested positive. And you're going to exclude those 3 guys. I don't know why you couldn't put them in the Hall of Fame with a part of their biography saying Barry Bonds was caught up in the Balco scandal, for example. So I don't think that this nonprofit organization is accomplishing its mission as a nonprofit, its mission to tell the base story of baseball without those 3 players, and I don't think that they have any credibility whatsoever.
I think that's a really interesting tension, right? And it's one that really is about the preciousness of baseball. Because, these things are just held in much more sacrosanct than they are in any of the other leagues, right? So, and you do have a real tension here about what is essentially in its physical manifestation a museum of the story of baseball. I mean, that, especially if you kind of go to their mission, if you were, if you've been lucky enough to go to Cooperstown, which I still haven't done, and I keep meaning to do it every summer. But, and I'm sure that's a wonderful experience, but I think it actually plays out to Steve's point. What do you wake up every day to be? You wake up every day to live your mission, which is to tell the story of baseball and all of its messy humanity, right? Which is, got tons of scandals, has tons of tainted eras, so on and so forth, right? There isn't any part of...
not a nice person.
Right, speed was given away in clubhouses for 40 years. People are people is the bottom line here. So, are you going to tell that story and honor that history, or are you this weird cabal for some kind of never attainable purity of the sport. And so that, Steve, that's what I think you said about the process, right? The Baseball Writers Association get all the power. That's highly, small p political in its own right. And it doesn't necessarily, to protect the sanctity of the game is a different mission than to tell the story of baseball. And if you look at any of the other Hall of Fames, look at something. There isn't even an NBA Hall of Fame, right? It's just basketball, and that's the
Football Hall of Fame is the Pro Football Hall of Fame also.
Right. So they first of all, they just don't have this. I don't know, this almost at this point, the yoke of history that makes them have to be special or more precious. It's this sort of false identity that keeps this just from being rational and normal.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's Major League Baseball holds the problem of disciplining Barry Bonds when his head grew 8 sizes, right? That's Major League Baseball's problem. The Hall of Fame is there to document the fact that this man had the greatest career of any hitter ever. The only 2 people who are even in the ballpark would be maybe 3, Babe Ruth, Hank Aaron, and Ken Griffey Jr. Beyond that, there's no one, and I would argue that Bonds' numbers are better than all of them. They objectively are definitely better than all of them. So I just don't know. I think they're mixing their tasks here. Your task is not to make a decision as to the morality of the fact that Bonds was a jerk who didn't treat reporters. Now, you see, you got to remember this. A lot of these reporters remember that Barry Bonds was a tremendous jerk, and so was Roger Clemens, and so was Curt Schilling. Curt Schilling had we don't do politics here, but Curt Schilling had expressed a bunch of political views that not a lot of sports reporters like. And he did it in a way that was kind of jerky, he didn't, and so they don't like the guy. So you got a lot of these curmudgeon-y reporters who just don't like these players and are not going to vote for them. David Ortiz, if your standard is steroids, David Ortiz should not be in the Hall of Fame. I don't have a problem with Ortiz being in the Hall of Fame. He probably is a Hall of Fame player, maybe marginally so, but if that's your line, why is he in the Hall of Fame? There are other players, as Chris said, who took greenies in the clubhouse. Greenies is slang for speed. They had them in bowls in the clubhouse. A lot of players did that.
It was just illegal 8 years ago. It was a recent policy change.
Right, exactly. And so this is the line in the sand with these 3 guys. Because I think you could argue, and Mark McGwire is probably the other one. I mean, you could argue Sammy Sosa's numbers aren't that from the totality of his career, but I don't know how you tell the story of baseball without Mark McGwire is the other one, so I don't understand. I think somebody needs to seriously redefine A, their voting procedure, and B, what their mission really is. And because I think both of them are hurting them. If it were me, I would get rid of the Pro Baseball Writers Association entirely and come up with a mix of MLB a couple of MLB front office people, a few active Major League Baseball general managers, some players that are in the Hall of Fame, some retired baseball expert types, Tony La Russa types. He might not be a good example, but somebody like that. And then you can have a few reporters. But the idea of having 300 reporters, most of whom aren't even involved in baseball, being the sole arbiter and screwing up the mission of the Hall, I just think is not good for the sport.
Yeah, I'm always kind of when a writer or sports media person drops that they're a member of the Major League Baseball Writers Association, I'm always like, really? Sometimes it doesn't seem like that hard a club to be involved in.
Here's a perfect example. I used to listen to Mike and Mike in the morning on ESPN before it went off, before they canned Mike Golick. For no reason. But one of those episodes, I remember one of these years when the Hall of Fame announcement was made, Mike Greenberg said, they offered me a vote. Mike, and he, to his credit, turned it down because he said, I'm not really a baseball guy. I'm just a talking head. I'm not really qualified, so he chose not to do it. Mike Greenberg has no business even being offered a vote. That's ridiculous. And again, Greenberg, to his credit, recognized that, so it's not a criticism of him. It's a criticism of the process. That's absurd. That's not the way to have credibility in your process at all.
And I think that therein lies the key problem. And to be clear, the Major League Baseball Writers Association is not the same as the baseballhall-of-fame.org, right? They have a collaborative relationship, they have a partnership, but they are two different entities, and I think that actually ends up being a problem. It ends up being a problem. It makes it difficult for the org, the Hall of Fame, to live its mission if it's outsourcing its key curatorial responsibility to an outside organization.
Yeah, I'm going to steal the thought of my work colleague, whose name I don't want to mention because he didn't give me permission to do so. But I was talking to him about this yesterday, and he brought up a very good point, which is that in years past, you might have needed writers to evaluate these players because it was very hard to get a true sense of how some of these players are without massive TV broadcasts, internet, stat packages all over the internet, YouTube, so much more visibility for baseball and players now than there were. If you go back 50 years ago, maybe the only the people who would know some of these players best were the local writers. And so there might have been an argument for that, but in today's world, that's just not the case anymore. And that was the point that my colleague made was, it's just not the same. There's such a greater number of people who could have a probably better perspective than the local writers now.
I think eventually we'll see a change in this. And also it just from a, it's a nonprofit, but it still has to run like not a business per se, but it still has to operate successfully, right? Just from a different set of IRS tax law rules about how they do that. And at some point, putting one a year of something into your museum is not a great sustainable business practice.
And excluding people who are so obviously qualified.
Or that people just at least want to hear the story, like you mentioned, Steve.
Well, I brought up the nonprofit thing for a reason, because it's important. A nonprofit has a mission statement that they have to comply with. This is how federal law works. If you have a nonprofit, you basically, in essence, have to tell the government, what are you doing to help society? Because, if we're going to let you escape paying taxes, there has to be some greater good. In this case, the greater good is telling the story of baseball. That's what it is. And they're just flat out not doing that. Pete Rose has over 4,000 hits, the all-time hit leader. Barry Bonds, the all-time home run king. Roger Clemens, 7 Cy Youngs, maybe the greatest, the most highly decorated pitcher in baseball history. You're not telling the story of baseball. You're not conforming with your mission as a nonprofit, I don't think.
No, I would agree with that. And let's move on.
I just wanted to rant. So rant over.
Next up is some interesting, I don't know, minor's the right word, but sort of drip stories around where the next Washington football team, by the time you actually listen to this, they probably will have a name, will reside and play their games in the DMV context. And these little pitter-pats came with new leadership in Virginia and from the Virginia side. So, Steve, what are these? These are some bills in the Virginia State House?
Yeah, so you got to, for those of you who aren't in the DMV, Glenn Youngkin won a very highly publicized gubernatorial election in Virginia and just took office 3 weeks ago, maybe? Very recently.
Turn of the year, yeah.
Yeah. Very recently. And so he's already advocated a couple bills in the Virginia legislature, which would resurrect a state-run sports authority to build a stadium. Okay, so here's how stadiums work. Unless your name is Stan Kroenke in today's world, or you have two owners, the Jets and the Giants, who have enough money collectively to build a stadium. Most other stadiums and arenas in the country are owned by a public-private entity. That's usually the something county or local sports authority, and those entities are owned typically by some combination of the local, city, county, and or state governments. Okay, that's the only way a lot of these stadiums can get funded. And so what Glenn Youngkin is, and they did this. They, meaning the state of Virginia, did this. Tried to do this to build to attract the Washington Nationals, who ended up being downtown D.C. But point is, they tried to do this before. So what Glenn Youngkin is proposing, and he's doing this now for a reason, because he's a new governor. He wants to make a splash. One splash he can make is to bring the Washington Redskins football team, Commanders, Admirals, whatever the case may be, to Virginia. And so he's proposed, this is a way to get this stuff financed, okay? You create or you resurrect and change the name of the current Virginia Sports Authority, whatever it's called. That's a way to funnel money into it to get a stadium built. And so this is Glenn Youngkin's major play to Dan Snyder and Tanya Snyder to say, come to Virginia. We'll let you gamble. We'll negotiate with you on things like split of parking, concession revenue, and everything, and we will help you. That is what Glenn Youngkin is saying, and he's no doubt doing it because he wants to make a splash as the new governor. And again, it's not about his politics. He was a controversial guy. That's not the point.
And I'd say, yeah, totally. And I'd say the other sort of accelerant here that, is represented by one of the first pieces of legislative agenda that you support and introduce in the weeks that you take over governor, is that Virginia's a bit of an odd state in that you're a lame duck governor the day you walk into office. You can only serve one term at a time. Now you can take breaks, and Terry McAuliffe in that election would have been a second-time governor if he had been elected, but not consecutively. So that sets up so that means that any governor on any topic has, the clock starts ticking on January 2nd. So these things take a while, and if he wants to be seen as the one that brings this and close the deal, he has to begin it in the first couple weeks of his governorship, because it's probably going to take the better part of those 4 years to get hammered out. And if he gets into the second half of that year as a default lame duck, it's going to be much harder. So he had to start it now.
Yeah, if you get past year 2, it's basically over for something like this. And just to show you, and if you want to read more about this, the Washington Post has a story about this in their Virginia politics section called Two Bills to Lure Washington Football Team to Virginia, filed in Richmond by Laura Vozella, dated January 21st. So what's interesting here is what it says is that Youngkin endorsed this idea a couple weeks ago in his very first speech to the General Assembly. And then look at who submitted the legislation. A Democrat from Fairfax and a Republican from Virginia Beach. So, and Glenn Youngkin is a Republican who, again, was a controversial guy, and it was a very controversial election and all of that. But my point here isn't to pick sides. My point is to say this is a bipartisan thing. Fairfax is a very, very liberal Democratic area. And Virginia Beach, much more conservative. So everybody's on board to do it. I think that's it shows that it's, I think, got a lot of steam in Virginia, and I really think that Rick Snyder, who's our who does Seasons of Discontent with us, the longtime beat writer, he's convinced me over the past year or two that Maryland, the National Harbor area in Maryland, probably isn't going to happen because of how much money the state of Maryland has spent already trying to get the casino there up and running and everything. So this truly might be the very best option to get a stadium built before the team's lease expires in 2027.
Yeah, there are certainly data points, and the trend has been Virginia. These things no one knows better than Steve, but these things can be messy and long, winding roads. So, but these definitely seem like updates to watch, and there's definitely been a lot of energy on multiple fronts about Virginia, and quite frankly, there's not a lot of fans for the team. No, they need fans, right? So we're starting from a place of scarcity in terms of a fan base. I think you have
stopped by saying there's not a lot of fans, period.
Yeah. So you've got to find new ones, and there are limited new ones north of D.C., and that's because of the Ravens. I know, and listen, I lived this and I believe it. And Washington and Baltimore are vastly different cities, but they are in fact geographically very close. And there's no doubt that since the Ravens showed up in Baltimore, they have been the better franchise in any way and any metric in which you would grade it. So you have limited fan growth north of the Beltway. You have more fan growth and also a traditional fan base to begin with south that, yes, has been, you can go all the way back to the Falcons, and the Panthers to a large degree have cut into that somewhat. But Washington was the Southeast team for a good long time. So if they're looking at customer expansion, South is more fruitful than North.
Well, it always has been. Even when the Colts were in Baltimore, the Redskins historically were not known as a North team. No. You're exactly right. They were known as the South team. They were the team of record for the Carolinas for a long time until the Panthers came. So yeah, I do think that's where their market is. But again, I mean, more importantly, yes, the governor of Maryland is Larry Hogan, and he came out and said, no, hey, listen, we still want Washington, but he hasn't taken the steps that the state of Virginia has, that Glenn Youngkin's openly endorsed it. The legislature submitted legislation to approve it. Maryland hadn't done any of that stuff. So I think certainly they're leading contender. And I will say this, I've said this before, but I'll say it again, because every once in a while somebody comes to the Hogsty, makes a comment, tweets at us something. The team would be silly to do anything but, rebuild an RFK site. So let me reiterate it for the 100th time. The federal government owns the RFK site. It is leased to the District of Columbia through 2038. And the lease expires in 2038. In order to get something built, anything done at the RFK site, it will require, at minimum, some sort of consent from both the federal government and the National Park Service. Two separate administrations, one Republican administration, one Democrat administration, have shown zero interest in that whatsoever. So, and on top of that, the local residents are strongly against building another stadium there. So as much as we would all love a stadium at the RFK site, it is extremely unlikely that would ever happen, because they would either have to sell the land outright to D.C. or enter a new 30-year lease to cover the length of time the stadium would be there. And that's, again, neither the Trump administration nor the Biden administration have shown one inkling of interest in that. So this truly may be the fact that the governor of Virginia and a bipartisan representative sample of the Virginia legislature are all behind it and have actively proposed legislation to get this process started. This is probably your best shot. I mean, the criticism is they're talking about Loudoun County, which is a long, long, long way out. But at the end of the day, I think the team would be willing to do it. They care less about that and more about selling tickets. And I don't think the fact that the stadium's in Loudoun County is going to keep them from selling any more tickets than they otherwise would.
Yeah, no, I agree. And we're a long way from any kind of conclusion to this story, so I'm sure we'll be checking back into that. A couple quick stories. I know we're running a bit long, but one fascinating thing that isn't dissimilar in some ways is that the NHL's Arizona Coyotes...
Are they the Phoenix Coyotes?
Oh, Phoenix Coyotes, yeah, I can never remember.
Neither
this
can
is coming,
the people of Phoenix.
Right, and this is coming from an NHL fan on my part. So they are not welcome back to their current stadium, and they are basically petitioning simultaneously both the league and the Players Association for the permission to play next season at Arizona State University's basically University Arena, which is a 5,000 capacity seat auditorium, which basically they say they have to go with hat in hand to both those entities and say, can we do this? Now, you might say, well, they don't have any fans anyway, big deal. And yes, they are the lowest attendance in the National Hockey League, but even at that metric, their average attendance in their current stadium is almost 12,000. It's 11,000 and change. So this still represents a reduction by more than half of their current fan capacity, which is low.
Now, the interesting part is Chris used the term "not welcome," and that's literally what happened here. So where they played was something called the Gila River Arena, and there was a lease between the team and the owners of the arena, and which is the city of Glendale, in one of these sports authority type arrangements. And basically, what happened is that the owners of the arena declined to renegotiate the lease at any price. They just said, it's you are not worth it for us. You're no longer welcome here because it is not financially worth it for us to continue to host 10,000 people at a time for your silly hockey games. And so they truly are just not. It's unbelievable to me that the major arena just said, yeah, we don't want to attend it. It's not financially viable for us to continue to have you there. So their only option is either leave Phoenix or go to ASU. 5,000 seats. I think you brought this up. I give Chris the credit for this, but I'm going to introduce the topic anyway. I think that this really goes to show that Chris was right. We talked about this beforehand. The dangers of expanding too much, and in areas in which it's not right to expand. Arizona is a desert. They don't play a ton of hockey there. There's not a natural too much of a natural hockey fan base there. There's a reason there's not a hockey team in Houston, Texas, because it's a swamp and they don't play hockey in Houston, Texas. And so NHL expanded a lot and into some cities that they probably shouldn't have. Arizona's one. I think it represents a danger it's a cautionary tale probably for all sports leagues.
Yeah, and that's in a world where they've actually had some success in non-typical markets like Nashville. So there's even
Columbus.
Yeah,
Ohio.
So there's even places where this actually has been successful. So to be this unsuccessful really is damning. And what this really brings up is why Phoenix, and also when do you have the ability to call a mistake and make, we all make them. It's about how you react to and change mistakes, not the fact that you made them. And so maybe to sum this up a bit, is Adam Protow in the Hockey News said this. The Coyotes playing at ASU's 5,000-seat arena next season could be a major embarrassment for the NHL, especially at a time when cities such as Houston, so he's even using Houston as a positive counterbalance, Quebec City and Kansas City are better prepared to host a team. NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman has fought tooth and nail to prevent the Coyotes from relocating, but at this point the writing is on the wall for them. Not only are the Coyotes a mess on the ice, they are now scrambling to help just to have home games to play in. How many black eyes will it take for Bettman and team owners to stop propping up Arizona up? Bettman's staunch defense of the Coyotes has been admirable to a degree, but now it seems increasingly delusional.
Now, the Arizona Phoenix Coyotes used to be the Winnipeg Jets. Winnipeg is in Canada. Canada's a bunch of hockey fanatics. The city of Winnipeg has a current population of about 705,000. And then the metropolitan area is a little bit bigger, 778,000. That's not a huge market for a major pro team, which is why I'm surprised they're not there anymore. But I don't know how you have because hockey, the NHL has made major progress in the past several years, growing the game, growing their fan base, getting back on TV in a meaningful way, having sort of hockey being in the public consciousness again when it wasn't for a long time. I don't know how you have a team continue to operate when you have 5,000 fans at a time. I think it's impossible. And the sooner Gary Bettman owns up to it and just sees reality and moves his team, the better off everybody will be.
Funny enough, you bring up Winnipeg because they actually do have a team again, and they're now called the Winnipeg Jets again. But that team,
I should have mentioned that. Sorry.
Yeah, but what's just kind of funny is because the team, how Winnipeg got its team back is that the Atlanta team, which did actually just call it a day and move there in 2011. And it's not just move the team to Canada, although those are potential sites. There's all kinds of different places, and you look at the rollout in places like Vegas and Seattle. It's just like sometimes a market's not for you, and these leagues should not be so driven to continue to make the same mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's other markets out there. There's other markets. So, pick one. Pick one that is not in a desert. Let's start there. I mean, yes, you want to grow the game to be a national game. I get it. But perhaps you shouldn't have expanded the game into a league in which, is most famous for being a desert where it gets to be 100 degrees, 120 degrees in the shade. Seriously. So it's like we said, I think it's just the sooner NHL wises up about this and stops embarrassing themselves, the better off they are. And just so, because I know Chris is a hockey fan, but I know there's not a ton of hockey fans, so I'm just going to read off some of where these teams are now. Florida Panthers, Tampa Bay Lightning, Toronto Maple Leafs, Boston Bruins, Detroit Red Wings. Those three are core, long-time teams. Buffalo Sabres, Ottawa Senators, Montreal Canadiens, Pittsburgh, Carolina, New York, Washington Capitals, Columbus Blue Jackets, New York Islanders, New Jersey Devils, Philadelphia Flyers, Colorado, Nashville, St. Louis, Minnesota, Dallas, Winnipeg, Chicago, which is a core team. Arizona, Original six, thank you. Vegas, Anaheim, Los Angeles, Calgary, San Jose, Edmonton, Vancouver, and Seattle. So, really, the teams, there's 1, 2, 3 of them, other than Arizona, which are in questionable markets. The Florida Panthers, the Tampa Bay Lightning, the Carolina Hurricanes, and then you've got the Arizona Coyotes. Those are in non-traditional markets. Now, Chris, I'm putting you on the spot. Do you have any idea how those other teams are doing in their local markets?
They're doing generally pretty well. They're nowhere near what the Coyotes have been. I mean, the NHL had to own the Coyotes for a while. I mean, it's this is
they went in bankruptcy a few years ago.
This has always been a problem. Carolina. Well, first of all, you have success. So, like all these things, if you win on the field, on the ice, on the pitch, whatever, then you do better. So, Tampa Bay Lightning, have won multiple Stanley Cups. That helps, right? So,
Florida Panthers are in first place.
Yes, so they're good. So some of those places have just been blessed by having good teams, and that's how you build a fan base. Also, where you see non-traditional markets in the NHL, Nashville, they were the first pro team to go into a place like Nashville, which is now, it both has its entertainment roots and power and has grown as a city in other ways. So, but they were the first in, so they were treated like conquering heroes. Same thing in Vegas, right? These are first pro sports teams. They're going to have an audience and a special place in the city's hearts.
And those two teams faced off in the Stanley Cup Finals, which doesn't hurt.
That does not hurt. So I think you see where you see things, the NHL take a foothold, there's generally other reasons, or, that they've done the right kind of audience building. Vegas and Nashville are entertainment towns, right? They're going to know how to package it. They're going to know how to make a splash. They're going to know how to link industries.
Well, because listen, I mean, Nashville does have a winner, but there's not a ton of kids playing hockey in Nashville. But the Predators, I have family in Nashville, the Nashville area, and the Predators have really ingrained themselves in the community, and that is all anybody cares about. They care probably more about the Predators than they do the Titans, to be perfectly honest. They are fanatics about the Nashville. It has worked like gangbusters. And, but again, it's not a desert. I just think Arizona is just totally wrong. And yeah, okay, Florida, the two Florida teams are succeeding from a fan base standpoint, I guess. But, I think it may be more of a one-off thing than not. I don't know. Maybe
I think if you were really being cold and calculating, you'd move one team out of Florida, and it would be the Panthers. But at the same time, they're not anywhere near the level of dysfunction that the Coyotes are. So they can.
So the Coyotes have multiple problems.
Yeah.
So what Chris is getting at here. So you're in the wrong market. You're in the middle of a desert. You have a they're the Washington Redskins of hockey. They've probably worse. They've been driven into bankruptcy. They're not a good team. On the ice, they're in last. They're 10-28 right now. I'm looking at the standings on ESPN. They're 10 at last place in the Western Conference Central Division, and so they're a lousy team, lousy market. Yet nobody cares about them. The people of Phoenix are interested in the Cardinals and the Arizona Diamondbacks, both of which are doing okay. Now it's just not working. Probably isn't ever going to work there.
No, just call, and yeah, move. So there's the bottom line. And I think at this point, as many black eyes as Bettman thinks he'll take here, you don't, it's a sunk cost at this point. So just move on. And I think a 5,000 seat stadium is way too much of a black mark on the league.
I think that's worse than moving him.
Oh, I think 100 out of 100 times it's worse. We have one quick story, just because we love to check in on the streaming wars. So the streaming wars are obvious. We talk about the big money of sports teams, but often most of these sports teams, or at least or the broadcast rights for them, are just pieces of a larger international multi-conglomerate portfolio, right? So everything's scale, everything's contextual. So with that in mind, the streaming wars, which really represent how we watch, read, see, and hear things in the world, and what corporate machinations have that. Netflix has taken a beating this week as their Q4 reports on subscribers and revenue were not great. Maybe could be categorized as bad or a downward trend, and their stock price then took also a hit. So that's just interesting. But if you look at almost all the other streamers, what is one thing in their portfolio they can offer at least a slice of? And then that is some version of live sports. That might be long tail. That might include car racing and other things, right? But they offer something live in the sports arena where Netflix not only doesn't have anything in the live sports arena, but they don't even have a reputation really for like sports documentaries or post-week commentary shows. They are flat-footed on sports, and you have to wonder if that's the differentiator here.
Well, I think Netflix has had their place in the market shrunk dramatically over what they started out with. What were they, think about in the beginning, early stages of Netflix, what did they do? Their primary market was to send movie DVDs on this rotating subscription service to your house, right?
That's funny.
Yeah, it is. And, and that was what they did. And they were competing with Blockbuster, and Blockbuster famously passed up buying Netflix for what amounted to a song back years ago. And but at one point in time, Netflix was the principal source to get to watch movies that were not first run in the theater. They were really not the only source, but they were one of very few. What has happened in the intervening years is that these movie studios have all wised up. There's now a Paramount streaming network. All the Paramount movies are there. Disney keeps all their movies there. Years ago, they would all sell their movies to Netflix. Nobody's doing that now. And so Netflix's position in the entertainment market has shrunk dramatically, and their response to it has been to create a lot of different programming. They produce a huge amount of shows, but most of what is on Netflix now is produced by Netflix or produced for Netflix. They're buying stuff. There are very few movies by new movies from major movie studios that are going to Netflix now. And so their position in the market has gone from we are the king of movies to we are just another streaming service. And I think it's interesting, something I never thought about before Chris brought this up, which is that they haven't been involved in any of these that I can remember or think about, any of the streaming of the wars for live sports. We haven't heard them talk about football, basketball, baseball, none of it. And they don't do any of it. And you're right, they don't do a ton of sports documentaries or anything either. And so I think they've lost a lot of market share because of it. Think about this. I think the Peacock network is being propped up solely by live sports at this point. I mean, the Olympics is on there. They're sending NFL playoff games there. But Netflix doesn't have any of that, and so I think the Netflix market share has shrunk dramatically. When I say market share, I mean of sort of the broad entertainment universe has shrunk dramatically, and this is reflected in their earnings and in their stock price, which, as Chris said, has gone down. There's a CNBC article I'm reading, Netflix shares fall 20% on slow subscriber growth, by Jessica Brzezinski, I guess, January 20th. So, but anyway, it's very interesting.
Yeah, and it also is like Netflix was the only one, or was the first one of these streaming services. So they sort of had, they had the market to themselves for a couple years, and now I think, HBO Max just went above 75 million subscribers. It's been way more successful than they even thought it would be for a variety of reasons. So that's cut in deeply.
Getting first-run movies is the main reason.
And they made the announcement that all movies that Warner Brothers produced would be simultaneously available on their service.
And Game of Thrones was on HBO Max.
Yeah, and all that HBO, plus they have the library. So it's been successful. You bring up Peacock is super fascinating because they also, I just read an article, I'm not going to get the numbers exactly right, but you're right about being propped up. I think it's probably smart, and it probably will eventually pay off. But they only are around like 25 million subscribers, and they are losing $500 million right now. Like, it is like for, what NBC, Comcast, whatever that, I can't ever remember, sometimes the big corporate giants eventually. It's a loss leader for them right now, and they probably figured this. I think they knew this, but
there's a long tail vision for it.
Yes, but right now it is hemorrhaging money.
Yeah, it is. It's hemorrhaging money, and why? It has no buzz. What are they doing to create buzz? Live sports. They got criticized with their handling of the Summer Olympics, but the idea that they put so much of it on Peacock was a direct. What's the word I'm trying to say? It was a direct reaction to Peacock getting hammered. If you have, if you have to go to Peacock to watch the Olympics, the idea was that's going to drive people, and of course it didn't work for a variety of reasons. But we're going to see more and more and more of that on Peacock for sure. It's the only way they can prop it up.
Yeah, I mean, if you are if you pay for Peacock directly, or you get your cable subscription, if you still have
indirectly paying for it.
Right, you can log in to NBC.com. So
yes.
Either through Peacock or NBC.com or whatever versions of apps, or you can watch their football coverage. You can watch these playoff games. So I mean, that wasn't a reality 2 or 3 years ago, right? So and that's just the beginning there. But you can, and this year I've seen a much more concerted effort for watch on NBC.com, watch on Peacock. They're being much more intentional about telling you that these are these Comcast or whatever NBC owned entities that you can actually go and watch the games. And you have to have the passwords and the credentials and have paid for it at some point in some chain, but you can watch them there. And sure enough, you're going to see ads for Yellowstone and ads for all kinds of stuff, whether it's catalog library stuff or new stuff on Peacock. And that's the eventual goal, or that is the goal.
You're mixing up. Peacock's on Yellowstone's on Paramount, but yeah.
No, but not streaming. Is it really?
We talked about this before.
Yeah,
I could never keep track of where Yellowstone is.
This is so Wild West that deals that people did 2 and 3 years ago, where you have a certain studio produce this, and then but they license it over here. That's why you will still eventually see some things on Netflix. It's just because they have to. The contract isn't up yet on those original lease deals. So everything's so Wild West that you haven't seen the conglomeration. That Paramount would never do that again, right? So, and all the new Yellowstone-related shows will be squarely Paramount. But
here's the point. Okay, and I just opened my Peacock app because I get it through Xfinity, and yes, Yellowstone, here we go. Season 1, watch it. So... But point here is this. What is Netflix doing? Nothing. And they're losing market share their stock prices is shrunk, and their revenues are not where they want to be.
Their strategy, and we don't have to go too deep in this, but their strategy, which I guess from this data would suggest that it's not working or working fully, has been international. So they buy up a ton of international content. They service that international content into other markets, so it seems fresh and new, but really, is new to the new markets. And that they are going for a more global subscriber. And that's why when you go on Netflix, you see a ton of Korean dramas and stuff like that. Yeah,
that Squid Games
yeah.
thing is from Korea. There's a lot of Netflix everywhere. There's Netflix Europe and Netflix Korea and Netflix all. There's not like Paramount.
No, they have a global, and then that takes time, right? So, and you can't if you've got a long-term business strategy, then one quarterly earnings statement should not be shaking you at your foundation, or you shouldn't be in it.
No, we're not saying Netflix is dying.
No.
It's just interesting to show the nexus between a shrinking of market share and revenue to the total lack of sports.
And they'll get sports. I think you'll see them enter the conversation. It might be like Formula One, right? It might be something that's not a little off the beaten track, something with a more of an international audience, because that's part of their strategy. But you'll see them get something.
Yeah, at some point. Yeah.
I'm sure we'll be talking about it when they do. Steve, what how are you throttling down here in an off-season mode?
Hey, listen. I mean, in terms of the hog size coverage, the off-season is our Super Bowl. Because the team doesn't ever sniff that level. So, we love talking about the draft and free agency and all of that. And that is where we're headed on the Hogside podcast and on the website. Is we're in the throes of free agency previews. We're going to start our draft coverage here in a couple weeks, which is, I love the draft. And so that's what we're doing on the Hogside. Seasons of Discontent is taking a little break. They will be back around free agency time, and they'll do some more stuff for the draft. They typically skip a bunch of shows in the off season just because Rick has other things to do. But we have all of that in our regular written content, so please check in.
All right, and when we talk to you in 2 weeks, we're a little bit in the middle of the news cycle, but I'm sure we'll be discussing a little bit the rollout of 2-2-2-2-2-2-2.
Oh yeah, yeah, 2-2-2-2-2-2-2-2. Ugh, just don't even get me started. This show will be 3 hours if you let me rant about that right now.
All right, well, we'll know by then. So see you in 2 weeks.